The air in the chamber was cold and still, a sharp contrast to the furious debate that had just subsided. Outside, the sounds of Constantinople, a city humming with 1,000,000 lives, seemed muted, distant. A single lamp cast long dancing shadows on the stone walls, flickering over a map laid out on a heavy oak table. On this map, the vast tapestry of the known world seemed to shrink, with the Holy Land a small, distant smudge to the east, a place known mostly through the tales of pilgrims and the whispers of merchants. The man who stood over the table, his face etched with the weight of an empire, was Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. His breath misted in the cool air, and he traced a trembling finger along the familiar lines of Anatolia, a land increasingly swallowed by the encroaching Seljuk Turks. These were not just whispers. These were the cries of his people, the pleas of his generals. He had sent an embassy to the west, to Pope Urban II, hoping to secure a few hundred mercenaries to help him reclaim his lost lands. He was seeking a tactical advantage, a small but sharp blade to thrust into the heart of the Seljuk advance. Yet, as he stared at the map, he could not have known what was to come, that his simple request for aid would spark a cataclysmic movement, a tidal wave of pious zeal and military ambition that would change the course of history forever. What happened when the Pope's answer arrived, and it was not a handful of soldiers, but a call to arms for all of Christendom? Did you know this was the moment that set in motion the entire fascinating story of the Crusader States? It began with a speech. Pope Urban II, a man of profound intellect and strategic vision, stood before a great council at Clermont in 1095. He did not merely grant the emperor his mercenaries. He took the emperor's desperate plea and reframed it as a holy mission. He painted a vivid picture of the suffering of Christians in the Holy Land, of the desecration of sacred sites, and of the path to spiritual redemption for all who would take up the cross. The rhetoric was potent, a masterful blend of faith, feudal obligation, and the promise of land and glory. The response was electric. Men from every walk of life, from great lords to landless peasants, knelt and swore a vow. They took a piece of cloth and sewed it in the shape of a cross onto their clothing, signifying their commitment to the journey. They were not simply soldiers anymore. They were crusaders. The word itself, crusade, came from the Latin cruciata, meaning marked with a cross. The journey east was a chaotic, disorganized affair. The first wave, often called the People's Crusade, was a ragtag collection of peasants, women, and even children, led by charismatic but inexperienced preachers like Peter the Hermit. They were ill-equipped, undersupplied, and largely unaware of the immense distance and dangers that lay ahead. This group's journey was marked by desperation and violence, including brutal attacks on Jewish communities in the Rhineland. Most of them were eventually slaughtered by the Turks in Anatolia, a tragic and sobering prelude to what was to come. It was a lesson in the grim realities of such a vast undertaking. The main force, the Prince's Crusade, was a different beast entirely. It was composed of several independent armies, each led by one of the great feudal lords of Europe. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, and his brother Baldwin of Boulogne. There was Raymond IV of Toulouse, a count of immense wealth and power, and Hugh of Vermandois, the brother of the French king. Then there was Bohemond of Taranto, a cunning Norman-Italian prince known for his military prowess. These men were rivals as much as they were allies. They marched separately, their individual motivations ranging from genuine piety to naked ambition. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The sheer scale of this movement was unprecedented. Never before had such a large, diverse force marched so far for a common cause, even if that cause was interpreted differently by each leader. The sheer logistical challenge of feeding and moving an army of tens of thousands, along with their non-combatant followers, was monumental. The Crusaders' journey across the vast and unfamiliar landscape of Anatolia was a trial by fire. They faced ambushes, a famine, and disease. The Seljuk Turks employed a hit-and-run strategy, avoiding large-scale battles and instead harassing the Crusaders, cutting off their supply lines and poisoning wells. The discipline of the different Crusader armies varied wildly, and internal squabbles were a constant threat. Historians still argue whether the disorganization of the First Crusade was a major weakness, or if it was, in a strange way, a strength. Since there was no single supreme commander, the loss of one leader did not spell the end for the entire campaign, and different armies could pursue different objectives, ultimately leading to the establishment of multiple states. It was a chaotic, often brutal, and utterly transformative journey. The Crusaders were not merely marching towards a holy city. They were forging a new reality in the East, one that would be defined by the complex relationships and lasting legacies they were about to create. Their first major victory was the siege of the city of Nicaea, a strategically important Seljuk capital. The Byzantine forces, who had initially been wary of the large Crusader army, had played a key role in this siege. The Crusaders laid siege to the city from the land, while the Byzantine navy blockaded the lake, cutting off any possibility of resupply. The Seljuks, realizing their position was hopeless, surrendered to the Byzantines rather than the Crusaders. This annoyed the Crusaders, who had been promised loot and glory, but it set a precedent for the complicated and often strained relationship they would have with their Byzantine allies. It was a good example of the old saying, "No good deed goes unpunished." After Nicaea, the Crusaders continued their long and difficult march east, a journey that would lead them to a place that had only existed in their minds as a wholly distant land and was about to become a very real and very bloody home. That long and difficult march, a journey defined by hardship and death, eventually brought the Crusader armies to the ancient and formidable city of Antioch. But before that, one of the most remarkable and pivotal moments occurred. While the main Crusader force was marching through Cilicia, a separate group under the command of Baldwin of Boulogne, the brother of Godfrey, decided to split off. He was not looking for glory in battle, at least not in the same way as the others. He was looking for a territory of his own. He was a landless lord from Europe, and the opportunities for him back home were limited. His ambition led him and his small contingent of knights southeast, away from the main route to Antioch and Jerusalem. This was a hugely significant decision, as it fundamentally altered the nature of the crusade from a simple pilgrimage or military campaign into a mission to establish a permanent presence. Baldwin's journey took him to the County of Edessa, a wealthy and strategically important city in what is now southeastern Turkey. Edessa was a Christian city, but its ruler, a man named Thoros, was Armenian Orthodox, not Latin Catholic. Thoros, facing constant pressure from his Seljuk neighbors, welcomed Baldwin and his small army with open arms. He saw them as powerful allies who could protect his city. Baldwin, however, was not content to be a simple protector. He was a savvy political operator. He quickly ingratiated himself with the local populace, and in a move that still raises a few eyebrows among historians, managed to get himself adopted as Thoros's heir. This was not the smoothest of adoptions, as Thoros was soon after assassinated, and the populace, having been won over by Baldwin's charm and military might, clamored for him to take control. Thus, in 1098, the first of the Crusader states was born, the County of Edessa. It was a testament to the raw ambition and opportunism that lay just beneath the surface of the religious zeal of the First Crusade. The new county was a strange and isolated outpost. It was surrounded on all sides by hostile Muslim territories and was far from the main Crusader route. Its survival was a miracle in itself, a constant struggle against a tide of enemies. It was a place where Frankish knights, with their heavy armor and feudal customs, had to learn to live and rule over a diverse population of Armenians, Syriac Christians, and local Muslims. The County of Edessa was a fragile creation, always on the edge, always looking over its shoulder. It was a crucial early experiment in the Crusaders' attempt to govern the East. Meanwhile, the rest of the Crusader army, unaware of Baldwin's little side quest, was facing the monumental challenge of taking Antioch. The city was a vast, ancient metropolis, protected by a massive double wall and an imposing citadel. It was one of the largest and most well-defended cities of its time, and its siege would prove to be one of the most brutal and drawn-out episodes of the entire crusade. The siege began in October 1097, and the Crusaders settled in for a long, cold winter. The conditions were horrific. There were rampant shortages of food, and the Crusaders were forced to resort to desperate measures to survive. The army was starving, and morale was at an all-time low. Desertions were a constant problem. Even some of the great lords, like Stephen of Blois, decided that this particular holy mission was a bit too much for their liking and packed up and left. But the Crusaders were saved by a series of fortunate events. In a stroke of luck, a crusader named Fairuz, a Muslim who had converted to Christianity and was disgruntled with his commander, betrayed the city. He agreed to let a small group of crusaders scale the walls and open a gate. This plan was spearheaded by Bohemond of Taranto, the cunning and ambitious Norman prince. He was a master of siege warfare and political maneuvering, and he saw the capture of Antioch as his chance to carve out a territory of his own. In the chaos of the night, a small force of crusaders entered the city, and soon the main army flooded in, leading to a brutal massacre of the Muslim inhabitants. Their victory, however, was short-lived. Just as they had secured the city, a large Muslim relief army, led by Kerboga of Mosul, arrived and surrounded the Crusaders. They were now the besieged, trapped inside the city they had just conquered. The situation was even more desperate than before. They were starving, exhausted, and now faced a fresh and well-supplied enemy. It was during this desperate time that a poor pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew came forward with an extraordinary claim. He said he had a vision from Saint Andrew, who told him that the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Jesus, was buried beneath the floor of the Church of St. Peter in Antioch. The Crusader leaders, including the skeptical Raymond of Toulouse, were at their wits' end and agreed to the search. They dug furiously for a whole day, finding nothing but dirt. Just as they were about to give up, Peter himself jumped into the trench, and in a moment that could have been either divine intervention or a bit of clever sleight of hand, pulled out a piece of iron. The discovery was proclaimed as a miracle. It was a psychological masterstroke. The morale of the Crusaders, which had been at rock bottom, soared to unimaginable heights. They now believed they were protected by God Himself, armed with a piece of the holiest relic in Christendom. This newfound religious fervor gave them the strength to do what seemed impossible. They marched out of the city gates and attacked the much larger, much better rested army of Kerboga. The ensuing battle was a miracle in its own right. The Crusaders, fueled by desperation and religious zeal, routed the Muslim army. Antioch was theirs, and their path to Jerusalem was now clear. With Antioch secured and the Muslim relief army defeated, the Crusaders had a choice to make. They could settle in their new, hard-won territory, or they could continue south toward their ultimate goal, the holy city of Jerusalem. The answer was not as clear-cut as one might think. Many of the Crusaders, exhausted and weakened by the long journey and the brutal siege, were ready to go home. The common soldiers, however, who had endured so much hardship for the sake of the pilgrimage, were restless. They saw the capture of Jerusalem as the entire point of the mission. They pressured their leaders relentlessly to move on. The leaders themselves were in a state of disarray. Bohemond of Taranto, who had proven himself a masterful strategist, was not about to leave the prize he had so cunningly won. He argued that the capture of Jerusalem was impossible without a strong base of operations, and he used every political trick in the book to ensure he was the one who got to keep Antioch. He succeeded, and the Principality of Antioch was born. It was another significant moment, another shift from a unified pilgrimage to the establishment of individual feudal states. The other leaders, with the exception of the wealthy and powerful Raymond of Toulouse, eventually agreed to this new arrangement. The army, now a fraction of its original size and far less organized, finally began the final leg of the journey to Jerusalem. They were a more hardened, more desperate group. They had survived famine, disease, and battle, and the promise of the holy city was the only thing that kept them going. The march south was relatively swift and met with little resistance. The Muslim rulers of the region were fragmented and disunited, and they had not yet recovered from the shock of the Crusaders' victories at Nicaea and Antioch. They offered little more than token opposition, a far cry from the fierce resistance the Crusaders had faced earlier. They arrived at the walls of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, a sight that must have been both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The city was surrounded by steep valleys on three sides, and its walls were massive, reinforced by towers and a deep trench. It was a formidable fortress. The Crusaders, exhausted and with few siege engines, were in a precarious position. The city's defenders, a Fatimid garrison from Egypt, were well provisioned and ready for a fight. The siege of Jerusalem was a race against the clock. The Crusaders knew that a large Egyptian relief force was on its way. They had to take the city quickly, or they would be trapped between the walls of Jerusalem and a powerful enemy army. In a testament to their religious fervor, the Crusaders prepared for the assault by holding a solemn procession around the city walls, barefoot, led by their priests and carrying relics. This was as much a psychological move as it was a religious one. They were not just soldiers fighting for a city, but pilgrims preparing for a holy war. This procession, accompanied by hymns and prayers, was meant to inspire the Crusaders and demoralize the defenders. After weeks of desperate fighting, the Crusaders finally broke through the walls. They built two massive siege towers, one led by Godfrey of Bouillon and the other by Raymond of Toulouse, and pushed them up against the city walls. The assault was bloody and chaotic. On July 15th, 1099, a group of knights, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, managed to get their siege tower across a ditch and into position. They poured across the walls, fighting their way into the city, and soon the gates were opened for the rest of the army. What followed was one of the most brutal and controversial events of the entire crusade. The Crusaders, filled with a mixture of religious zeal and a desire for revenge for all the hardship they had endured, slaughtered the city's inhabitants. Muslims and Jews were massacred without mercy. The streets were said to have run red with blood. This event, so stark in its violence, left a scar on the historical memory of the region that endures to this day. It was a terrible and tragic conclusion to the First Crusade, a stark reminder that holy war was often anything but holy. The Crusaders saw their actions as a justified retribution, a cleansing of the holy city, but for the local populations, it was a horror beyond comprehension. With the city captured, a new problem arose. Who would rule this holy but bloody place? The leaders gathered to decide on the fate of Jerusalem. They offered the crown of the new kingdom to Godfrey of Bouillon, the most prominent and pious of the leaders. But Godfrey, in an act of deep humility and respect for the sacredness of the city, refused to be crowned king in the place where Jesus had worn a crown of thorns. He would not be a king, but rather the advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, a protector of the holiest site in Christendom. His refusal to take the title of king cemented his legendary status and established the most powerful of the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was a kingdom without a king, at least for a little while, but it was now a reality, a tiny Latin island in a vast sea of Muslim lands. While the Crusaders were busy establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem, one of their more persistent and ambitious leaders was still fighting to get his own piece of the pie. That man was Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse. Of all the major leaders of the First Crusade, Raymond was the wealthiest and one of the most devout. He had initially taken a vow not to return home and had even refused the crown of Jerusalem after Godfrey. However, he still desired a realm for himself, a lasting legacy in the Holy Land. His attention turned to the coastal city of Tripoli, a rich and well-defended port to the north of Jerusalem. The siege of Tripoli was a long and arduous affair, lasting for several years. Unlike the earlier sieges of Nicaea and Antioch, this was a slow, methodical effort. Raymond, with his remaining forces and new recruits who were arriving from Europe, began the siege in 1102. The city was a major trading hub with strong fortifications and a sizable garrison. The Muslim defenders were determined to hold out, knowing that losing the city would be a major blow to their power in the region. Raymond, however, was a patient man. He began by building a castle on a hill overlooking the city, which he named Mont Pèlerin, or Pilgrim's Mountain. This castle served as a base of operations and a constant source of pressure on the defenders. The Crusaders, now with a permanent base, could harass the city, cut off its supply lines, and wait for the right moment to strike. The siege was a test of endurance for both sides. The Crusaders faced hunger and disease, while the city's inhabitants endured constant bombardment and the threat of starvation. It was a slow, grinding process, a testament to the fact that not all medieval warfare was a series of heroic charges and dramatic battles. Sometimes it was just a long, boring wait. Raymond IV, unfortunately, did not live to see the end of his dream. He died in 1105, still camped outside the walls of Tripoli. His ambition, however, was passed on to his successors. His cousin William Jordan and later his son Bertrand continued the siege with the help of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and its powerful navy. Finally, in 1109, after years of relentless pressure, the city of Tripoli surrendered. The new Crusader state, the County of Tripoli, was born. It was the last of the four main Crusader states to be established, and its capture secured the coastline, connecting the other three states by land and sea. With the establishment of the County of Tripoli, the map of the Latin East was now complete. There were four main Crusader states: the County of Edessa in the north, the Principality of Antioch to its southwest, the County of Tripoli stretching along the coast, and the powerful Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south. This was a unique political landscape. These states were not a unified empire. They were a collection of independent feudal entities, each with its own ruler, its own laws, and its own interests. They were a bizarre and fragile creation, a collection of European-style kingdoms and counties transplanted onto the foreign soil of the Near East. The leaders of these new states faced a monumental challenge. They were a tiny Latin elite, a handful of knights and their followers, ruling over a vast and diverse population of Muslims, Jews, and various Christian sects, including Greek Orthodox, Syriac, and Armenian Christians. Their first order of business was to establish a system of governance. They did this by importing the feudal system from Europe. Lands were granted to loyal knights and nobles in exchange for military service and fealty to the ruler. Castles were built to secure territories and project power. The landscape of the Holy Land, once dotted with ancient towns and cities, now began to be punctuated by imposing stone fortresses, a visible sign of the new Latin power. The Latin settlers adapted to their new environment in surprising ways. Many of them married local women, and their children, the so-called Polani, were a new generation with a unique blend of Eastern and Western culture. They spoke multiple languages, wore a mix of European and Eastern clothing, and were more tolerant of their non-Latin neighbors than their parents had been. This was a society where a European knight might have a Greek Orthodox priest as a neighbor, a Muslim merchant as a business partner, and an Armenian wife. It was a strange and complex social experiment, a blending of cultures that was both beautiful and fragile. The Crusaders also had to learn to farm and trade in a new environment. They brought with them new crops and new agricultural techniques, but they also adopted local ones. The trade in spices, silks, and other goods from the East became a major source of wealth for the Crusader states, and the port cities of Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli flourished. The Latin presence, though often brutal and oppressive, also brought a new level of commerce and political stability to a region that had been fragmented by internal conflicts for decades. This period of settling in was a crucial moment for the Crusader states. They were no longer a temporary military camp. They were a permanent, if precarious, part of the landscape of the Near East. Their success depended on their ability to manage a delicate balance of power, both with their own people and with their powerful and often hostile neighbors. With the four main Crusader states established, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the County of Tripoli, the Latin settlers began the complicated process of coexisting with their neighbors. These neighbors were not just a hostile Muslim sea. They were a complex tapestry of different cultures, religions, and political factions. There were the Byzantine Greeks to the north and west, the powerful Seljuk Turks, the fragmented Turkish emirates in Syria, and the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. Early relations with all of them were a wild mix of conflict, cautious peace, and even unexpected alliances. It was a diplomatic chess game with no clear rules. For the Byzantines, the Crusader states were a bit of a mixed blessing. On the one hand, they had been a desperate plea for help that had gotten completely out of control. The Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had wanted a few mercenaries to help him reclaim his lost lands in Anatolia, and instead he got an army of unruly Franks who carved out their own territories. They had also refused to return the lands they had captured, like Antioch, to the Byzantine Empire, as they had initially promised. This led to a great deal of animosity and distrust. On the other hand, the Crusader states acted as a buffer, absorbing the pressure from the Muslim powers and protecting the Byzantine border. This created a strange, often tense, alliance where the two sides would occasionally fight each other, but would just as often cooperate against a common enemy. The relationship with the local Muslim powers was even more complex. In the early years, the fragmented nature of the Seljuk and Turkish emirates worked to the Crusaders' advantage. The Muslim rulers were often more concerned with fighting each other than with driving the Crusaders out. The Crusaders, being savvy political operators, were not shy about exploiting these divisions. They would form alliances with one Muslim ruler against another, or even hire Muslim mercenaries to fight their Christian rivals. For example, during the siege of Tyre in 1111, the Crusaders received aid from a local Turkish lord, and during one of their many wars, the Crusaders allied with the Seljuk Turks against the Fatimids of Egypt. These were not religious wars in the modern sense. They were medieval power politics, and in this game, an enemy of your enemy was definitely your friend, at least for the moment. This period of relative stability, often referred to by some historians as the Pax Orientalis, or Eastern Peace, was a time of unexpected cultural exchange. In the port cities and trading towns, Muslims and Christians lived side by side, engaging in commerce and even sharing knowledge. There was a level of tolerance that seems almost surprising to us today. European visitors to the Holy Land were often amazed at the level of cooperation and conviviality between the different religious groups. The Crusader states had to adapt to this reality. They were too few in number to rule by force alone, so they had to find a way to make the local population work with them. This created a fascinating hybrid society where a Latin lord might have a Muslim doctor, a Jewish financier, and a Greek Orthodox priest as part of his daily life. However, this peace was always fragile. It was based on the disunity of the Muslim world. The Crusaders were always aware that if a powerful, unified Muslim leader ever emerged, their days would be numbered. This was a fear that was never far from their minds. The military orders, the Knights Templar, and the Knights Hospitaller were formed during this period to address this very problem. They were not just a response to a general need for defense. They were a recognition of the fundamental weakness of the Crusader states. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller were a brand new kind of institution. They were a hybrid of military and monastic life. They took monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they were also trained warriors. The Templars, founded around 1119, had the specific mission of protecting pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. They quickly grew in power and wealth, amassing vast land holdings and becoming the bankers of the Latin East. The Knights Hospitaller, originally founded to run a hospital for pilgrims in Jerusalem, soon added a military wing to their order. They were responsible for the care of the sick and the wounded, but they also became one of the most formidable fighting forces in the region. The emergence of these military orders was a game changer. They were not just local feudal levies. They were a professional, standing army. They were fiercely disciplined, highly motivated, and unlike the fickle feudal lords, they were not bound by local politics. They were loyal only to the Pope. They built massive, imposing castles like the Croix des Chevaliers, which were not just defensive strongholds, but also symbols of the Crusader presence. These castles were strategically located along key trade routes and borders, acting as a network of defense that held the states together. The military orders were the backbone of the Crusader states' defense, their insurance policy against a unified Muslim threat. The military orders, with their imposing castles and disciplined fighting forces, gave the Crusader states a much-needed sense of security. But this feeling of permanence was an illusion. The fragile balance of power that had allowed the Crusader states to flourish was about to be shattered. The key to their survival had always been the disunity of the Muslim world. That disunity began to change with the rise of a new and formidable figure, Imad al-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul. He was a ruthless and ambitious leader who was determined to unify the Syrian territories and drive the Franks, as the Crusaders were called, out of the Holy Land. He was not a pious man in the traditional sense, but he understood the immense power of the jihad, the holy war, as a unifying force. Zengi began his campaign by conquering city after city, consolidating his power and creating a contiguous block of territory that threatened the northern Crusader states. The Crusaders, caught up in their own internal squabbles and feeling overly confident in their own strength, failed to recognize the gravity of the threat he posed. The northernmost Crusader state, the County of Edessa, was the most vulnerable. It was a lone outpost, far from the main body of the Crusader lands, and it had always been a target. Its ruler, Jocelyn II, was a brave but reckless man who had a tendency to get into fights with his neighbors, both Muslim and Christian, and he had recently left the city to tend to a personal dispute. In 1144, Zengi saw his opportunity. He laid siege to the city of Edessa, a siege that was swift and brutal. The city's defenders, mostly Armenian Christians, fought bravely, but they were no match for Zengi's disciplined army and powerful siege engines. On Christmas Eve of that year, the walls of Edessa were breached, and the city fell. A brutal massacre followed, though Zengi later showed a degree of restraint, allowing the Frankish leaders and their families to leave. The fall of Edessa was a seismic event. It was the first of the Crusader states to fall, and it was a devastating psychological blow to the Latin East. The loss of Edessa proved that the Crusader states were not invincible, and that a unified Muslim power was a threat that could not be ignored. The news of the fall of Edessa traveled slowly back to Europe, carried by a trickle of horrified pilgrims and merchants. The shock and outrage were immense. It was a call to action, a clear sign that the Holy Land was in peril. This time, the call for a new crusade was not made by a council, but was issued directly by the Pope, Eugenius III. The Pope entrusted the preaching of the crusade to a man of immense fame and piety, Bernard of Clairvaux, a powerful and influential abbot. Bernard was a brilliant orator, and he traveled throughout France and Germany, preaching the need for a new holy war. His words were so powerful that they stirred up a new wave of crusading fervor, a second great wave of men, women, and children ready to take up the cross. The Second Crusade, unlike the first, was led by two of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. This time, the crusade had royal support and royal leadership. It seemed that this time, with the backing of two major European kingdoms, success was all but guaranteed. But the reality was far different. The Second Crusade was a disaster from beginning to end, a textbook example of how not to run a military campaign. The two armies, one French and one German, took different routes to the Holy Land and were plagued by poor leadership, internal conflicts, and disastrous military decisions. The German army under Conrad III was the first to march. They were a disorganized rabble, and their journey across Anatolia was a repeat of the worst parts of the First Crusade. They were ambushed and annihilated by the Turks, and the few who survived had to limp their way to the coast and take a boat to the Holy Land. The French army under Louis VII fared only slightly better. They, too, were harassed by the Turks and lost a significant portion of their army. They finally arrived in the Holy Land, tired, demoralized, and much smaller than they had been when they started. The Crusader leaders in the Holy Land were not exactly thrilled to see their European saviors. The local barons, who had spent decades learning to survive in the East, were wary of the new arrivals, who seemed to have little understanding of the political realities of the region. The decision was made to attack Damascus, a city that was a crucial trading hub and a key to Muslim power in the region. The plan, however, was a total mess. The Crusaders, who had an initial advantage, were plagued by internal squabbles. The local barons of Jerusalem, fearing that a newly captured Damascus would fall into the hands of a European king, refused to cooperate with the French and German forces. After a short, half-hearted siege, the Crusaders retreated in humiliation. The Second Crusade was over, a total failure. It had accomplished nothing, had cost thousands of lives, and had made the situation in the Holy Land much, much worse. For the Crusader states, it was a profound disappointment and a sign that they could no longer rely on help from Europe. The disastrous failure of the Second Crusade left the Crusader states in a more precarious position than ever. Not only had the European armies failed to accomplish anything, they had also shown the disunity and weakness of the Latin rulers in the Holy Land. The Crusaders' enemies, however, had learned a valuable lesson. They had seen how easily a large, well-funded army could be defeated through a combination of scorched earth tactics and internal disarray. The time was ripe for a strong leader to emerge and unite the Muslim forces. That leader was Nur al-Din Zengi, the son of Zengi, the conqueror of Edessa. Nur al-Din was a different kind of leader than his father. While Zengi was a ruthless military commander, Nur al-Din was a pious and charismatic ruler who saw himself as the champion of the jihad. He was not just fighting for territory. He was fighting for a religious cause, and he used this to rally the Muslim world against the Crusader states. He was a master of political and military strategy. He began his campaign by taking the remnants of his father's empire and consolidating his power in Syria. He then turned his attention to his Muslim rivals, using a combination of diplomacy and force to bring them under his control. He understood that to defeat the Franks, he had to first unite the Muslim world. Nur al-Din's most brilliant move was his decision to focus on Egypt. At the time, Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a rival to the Sunni Caliphate in Baghdad, and it was a state in decline. The Fatimid court was plagued by internal conflicts and a succession of weak rulers. Nur al-Din, seeing an opportunity, sent his most trusted general, Shirkuh, and his young nephew, Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, or Saladin, to intervene in a civil war in Egypt. Their goal was to prop up a friendly vizier and extend Nur al-Din's influence over the country. The Crusader states, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem in particular, saw this as an immense threat. A unified Syria and Egypt would mean they were completely surrounded. The king of Jerusalem at the time, Amori the Therines, was a shrewd and capable monarch. He launched several campaigns to try and stop Nur al-Din's expansion into Egypt, but he was ultimately unsuccessful. The constant back and forth between the Crusaders and Nur al-Din's forces in Egypt was a tense and draining affair for both sides. It was a war of attrition, fought on a distant front, that slowly drained the resources and manpower of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In 1169, after years of campaigning, Shirkuh finally succeeded in taking control of Egypt. He was appointed vizier, but he died shortly after, leaving his young nephew Saladin in charge. Saladin, still technically a vassal of Nur al-Din, began to consolidate his power in Egypt. He abolished the Fatimid Caliphate and swore fealty to the Sunni Caliph in Baghdad, a move that pleased Nur al-Din, but also made Saladin the undisputed ruler of Egypt. He now controlled the wealthiest and most powerful state in the region, and his ambition was only just beginning to stir. The Crusaders, in a moment of sheer political naivety, failed to understand the monumental shift that had just occurred. They saw Saladin as a temporary vizier, a young upstart who would soon be replaced. But they were wrong. Saladin was a man of immense talent, and he began to quietly build his own power base, raising an army and a navy, and preparing for the day when he would no longer have to bow to anyone. He was a patient man, and he understood that his time would come. Nur al-Din, meanwhile, was concerned by his young protege's growing power. He was preparing to march on Egypt to reassert his authority over Saladin when he suddenly died in 1174. His death was a massive turning point. It left a power vacuum in Syria, and Saladin, the ambitious vizier of Egypt, was perfectly positioned to fill it. He was now free to act on his own authority. He launched a campaign to take control of Nur al-Din's former territories, and in a few short years, he had unified Syria and Egypt under his own rule. He was no longer just the vizier of Egypt. He was the sultan of a vast and powerful empire, and he was the undisputed leader of the jihad against the Crusader states. This was the moment the Crusaders had always feared. The disunity of the Muslim world was gone. The Latin East was now completely surrounded. With the death of Nur al-Din and the rise of Saladin, the Crusader states were facing their greatest external threat. But at the same time, they were grappling with a severe internal crisis, a problem that had been festering for decades and was about to come to a head. The issue was succession, particularly in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the heart of the Latin East. The kingdom had been ruled by a series of strong and capable kings, like Baldwin III and Amaury III, but this was about to change. The heir to the throne was Baldwin IV, a young man who was not only a child, but who was also, tragically, a leper. Baldwin IV was crowned king at the age of 13 in 1174, a few months after his father's death. It was quickly realized that he had contracted leprosy, a debilitating and disfiguring disease. In the medieval mind, leprosy was not just a physical ailment. It was seen by many as a divine punishment, a curse. Yet despite his illness and his young age, Baldwin proved to be an extraordinary monarch. He was intelligent, politically astute, and most importantly, a skilled and courageous military leader. He knew his time was limited, and he was determined to make his reign count. His reign was a constant struggle. He was not only fighting a war against Saladin, but also a political battle at home. The nobles of Jerusalem were divided into two main factions. There was the court party, a group of nobles who favored a more cautious and diplomatic approach with Saladin, and the courtyard party, a more aggressive faction that favored a more confrontational approach. The most prominent members of the courtyard party were Guy of Lusignan, a French nobleman who had married Baldwin's sister Sibylla, and Raynald of Châtillon, a powerful and ruthless lord of Transjordan who was known for his raids on Muslim caravans. Raynald's actions were often reckless and infuriating to Saladin, and he was a constant source of friction. Baldwin IV, despite his illness, managed to hold these factions in check and for a time managed to keep Saladin at bay. His greatest military victory came at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177. Saladin, believing that the young leper king was no match for him, led a large army into the kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin, though only 16, and so sick he had to be carried on a litter, rallied his forces and in a brilliant tactical maneuver, completely surprised and routed Saladin's much larger army. It was a stunning victory, a moment of glory for a kingdom that was slowly but surely beginning to decline. It was also a moment that made Saladin realize that this young king, despite his physical weakness, was a formidable opponent. But Baldwin's victory was a temporary one. His disease was advancing rapidly, and he was losing his sight and the use of his limbs. He knew he could not rule forever. The issue of his succession became a source of intense political maneuvering. He had no children, and his heir was his young nephew, Baldwin III, a son of his sister Sibylla and her first husband. However, Baldwin IV had to contend with the ambitions of Guy of Lusignan, his brother-in-law and a man he profoundly distrusted. He feared that Guy's ambition and recklessness would lead the kingdom to ruin. In a move of desperation, he had his nephew Baldwin V crowned as co-king. Baldwin IV's reign was a period of both remarkable resilience and profound vulnerability. He managed to hold the kingdom together and even win a few stunning victories, but he could not stop the political decay that was eating away at the heart of the kingdom. He died in 1185 at the age of 24, leaving his young nephew Baldwin V as the sole ruler. But the child king was sickly and died a year later. With his death, the carefully constructed succession plan of Baldwin IV fell apart. The crown was now in dispute. Sibylla, Baldwin IV's sister, claimed the throne for herself. She was married to the much-despised Guy of Lusignan, and she knew that if she was to be queen, her husband would be king. The nobles of Jerusalem were furious, but Sibylla, in a clever move, tricked them. She agreed to be crowned on the condition that she would divorce Guy and marry a new, more acceptable husband. The nobles agreed, and she was crowned queen. But at her coronation, she declared that she would not be divorced from Guy, and she crowned him king with her own hands. The coronation of Guy of Lusignan as king was the final, fatal mistake. He was a weak and indecisive leader, a man who had no experience in governing and who was deeply disliked by his own nobles. He was a disastrous choice for a kingdom that was facing its greatest external threat. The stage was now set for the final act, the confrontation between the fragile, divided kingdom of Jerusalem and the unified, powerful empire of Saladin. The political strife that had plagued the kingdom was now in the hands of a man who would lead them to ruin. The stage was now set for the final confrontation between the Crusader States and the unified Muslim power of Saladin. But before the final act could begin, we must pause for a moment to truly appreciate the man who orchestrated this momentous shift. Saladin, or to give him his full title, Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was not just a great military commander. He was a leader of immense political skill and a figure of legendary piety, a man who, in the eyes of his contemporaries, embodied the ideal of a Muslim warrior king. He was a Kurd, born in the city of Tikrit, in what is now modern-day Iraq. He was not a prince or a powerful noble by birth, but a soldier who rose through the ranks on the strength of his own merit. He was a protege of the great General Shirkuh, and as we remember from before, he was sent to Egypt to help his uncle secure power. When Shirkuh died, Saladin, still a young man, was left in charge. He was a quiet, unassuming figure, but his ambition was immense. He was a brilliant administrator, and he quickly reformed the Egyptian state, building a powerful navy and a disciplined army. He used the immense wealth of Egypt to fund his campaigns and to build a vast network of spies and informants. He was a man who understood that war was not just won on the battlefield. It was won through logistics, intelligence, and the hearts and minds of the people. After the death of Nur al-Din, Saladin moved with a speed and a cunning that was breathtaking. He had already consolidated his power in Egypt, and he now moved to take control of Syria. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as the rightful heir to Nur al-Din's legacy, the champion of the jihad against the Franks. He used diplomacy as much as he used force, often winning over cities and their rulers through negotiation rather than battle. He was a man who knew when to be patient and when to strike. He was not a brute. He was a man of culture and learning who was known for his generosity and his mercy, even to his enemies. His piety was not just for show. He was a genuinely devout man who saw his mission as a holy one. For the Crusader States, Saladin's rise was a nightmare come to life. They had been used to fighting fragmented and disorganized enemies, but they now faced a single, unified power that stretched from the borders of modern-day Libya to the edges of Mesopotamia. Saladin had them completely encircled. He was a patient and calculating opponent, a man who waited for his moment. He had signed a truce with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but he knew it was only a matter of time before it was broken. That moment came in 1187, a year that would live in infamy for the Crusader States. The truce between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was broken by none other than Reynold of Chatillon, the reckless and aggressive lord of Transjordan. Reynold, ever the opportunist, attacked a Muslim caravan that was traveling from Cairo to Damascus. This caravan was not just any group of travelers. It included Saladin's sister. It was an act of extreme provocation, a deliberate and audacious violation of the truce. Saladin was a man who, as we have discussed, was often merciful, but this was a personal insult that he could not let slide. It was a challenge to his honor and his authority, a clear sign that the Crusaders were not to be trusted. He swore a solemn oath that he would kill Reynold with his own 2 hands. Saladin's response was swift and decisive. He had been preparing for this war for years, and now he had his pretext. He gathered a massive army, the largest he had ever commanded, and marched on the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders, under the disastrous leadership of Guy of Lusignan, were in a state of disarray. Their internal conflicts had not subsided, and they were plagued by a series of terrible decisions. The decision was made to gather all the available forces and meet Saladin in a single, decisive battle. It was a strategy that would prove to be a fatal mistake. They were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, led by a king who had no idea what he was doing, and a group of nobles who were more interested in fighting each other than the enemy. The stage was now set for the final, tragic showdown. The Crusader army, united under the disastrous leadership of King Guy of Lusignan, made its way toward the Sea of Galilee, where Saladin's massive force was encamped. It was a scorching July in 1187, and the air was thick with heat and dust. The Crusader army was plagued by a fatal lack of water. They were marching through arid, sun-baked land, and their thirst was becoming unbearable. The one source of water, the springs of Saphoria, was a few miles to the west, but Guy of Lusignan, in a decision that historians still scratch their heads about, chose to bypass it. Instead, he listened to the advice of the rash and impetuous Reynold of Chatillon, who urged him to march directly to the relief of the besieged city of Tiberias. This decision was a fatal blunder. Saladin, a master strategist, had anticipated this move. He was waiting for them. He knew that a long march in the intense heat would exhaust the Crusaders and make them easy prey. He sent his cavalry to harass the Crusader army, showering them with arrows and forcing them to keep their ranks tight, slowing their progress to a crawl. The Crusaders, now exhausted and desperately thirsty, were a sitting duck. They were a pathetic sight, a long, winding column of men and horses stumbling through the dust, their armor an oven, their throats parched. On the morning of July 4th, 1187, the Crusader army reached the twin hills, known as the Horns of Hattin. It was a desolate, volcanic landscape, and there was no water to be found. They were trapped. The Crusaders had made the fatal mistake of letting Saladin dictate the terms of the battle. The Muslim army surrounded them completely, blocking their path to the sea and the water they so desperately needed. The battle itself was a short and brutal affair. The Crusader army, demoralized and exhausted, was no match for Saladin's fresh and disciplined troops. Saladin's archers and cavalry relentlessly attacked the Crusader ranks, and the hot, dry air was so thick with dust and smoke from fires that the Crusaders could barely see their enemies. Many of the Crusaders, maddened by thirst, broke ranks and tried to flee toward the sea, but they were cut down by Saladin's men. The military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, fought with a suicidal bravery, but they were overwhelmed and slaughtered. The true cross, the holiest relic in Christendom, was captured, a devastating symbolic and psychological blow. The defeat was a total catastrophe. The Crusader army was completely annihilated. The vast majority of the Crusader leadership was either killed or captured, including the king, Guy of Lusignan, and the reckless Reynold of Chatillon. The capture of the king was a moment of immense triumph for Saladin. He had won a decisive victory, a victory that would change the course of history. After the battle, Saladin showed his famed generosity to most of the captured nobles, including King Guy. He even offered Guy a cup of rosewater, a symbolic gesture of clemency. However, he reserved a special fate for Reynold of Chatillon, the man who had broken the truce and infuriated the Sultan. Saladin had sworn an oath to kill him with his own hands, and he was a man of his word. In a dramatic and chilling moment, Saladin personally executed Reynold, a final act of vengeance for the caravan attacks. The rest of the captured Templar and Hospitaller knights were also executed, a grim testament to the Mamluks' fear and respect for these warrior monks. Historians still argue whether Saladin was right to show so little mercy to the knights, but for him, it was a necessary act to break the back of the Crusader fighting force. The Battle of Hattin was a turning point of the Crusades. It wasn't just a military defeat, It was the end of an era. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had lost its army, its king, and its holiest relic. The cities and castles of the Latin East were now virtually defenseless. The Crusader States were a house of cards, and Saladin had just blown on it. The path to Jerusalem was now wide open. With the Crusader army annihilated at Hattin, the Crusader States were a kingdom without a defense. The small garrisons left in the various towns and castles were no match for the might of Saladin's army. The aftermath of the Battle of Hattin was not a single grand confrontation, but a methodical, almost leisurely conquest. Saladin, with his forces now numbering in the tens of thousands, began a campaign to retake the major cities and strongholds of the Latin East. One by one, they fell. The fortified cities of Acre, Sidon, Beirut, and Jaffa all surrendered, their defenders knowing that resistance was futile. The Crusaders' most formidable castles, once thought to be impregnable, also fell, either through siege or through negotiated surrender. The ultimate prize, of course, was Jerusalem. The Holy City, the very reason for the First Crusade, was now virtually undefended. Its walls, while still formidable, were manned by a skeleton crew of knights and a terrified populace. The city's inhabitants, a mix of Latin Christians, Greek Orthodox, and local Muslims, braced themselves for the inevitable. The news of the loss of the Crusader army had reached the city, and the fear was palpable. Many remembered the brutal massacre that had occurred when the Crusaders took the city almost a century earlier, and they feared a similar, if not worse, fate. Saladin arrived at the gates of Jerusalem in September 1187. The city's remaining defenders were led by Baldwin of Boulogne, a respected and capable nobleman who had survived the Battle of Hattin. Bouillon knew that a military defense was impossible, and he began negotiations with Saladin. The Sultan's initial demand was simple: surrender or die. He was a man of his word, and the memory of the Crusader massacre of 1099 was still fresh in his mind. He was determined to take the city by force, as a matter of principle and as a religious obligation. But Bouillon, a shrewd diplomat, appealed to Saladin's sense of mercy and an honor. He threatened that if the siege continued, the defenders would destroy the city's sacred shrines, including the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and would kill their own families before surrendering. Saladin, a man who respected the holy sites of all religions, was moved by this plea. He agreed to a negotiated surrender, a move that stunned the Christian world. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem officially surrendered to Saladin. What followed was a moment of remarkable leniency and grace. Saladin did not order a massacre. Instead, he allowed the Latin inhabitants of the city to ransom themselves and their families. For a small fee, they could leave the city safely. For those who could not afford it, Saladin, in an act of profound charity, paid their ransoms himself or allowed them to leave for free. The Knights Hospitaller, who had taken a vow of poverty, also worked tirelessly to help the poor and the sick leave the city. This was a stark contrast to the brutal and bloody conquest of the city by the Crusaders almost 90 years earlier. Saladin's mercy was a testament to his character and a powerful statement to the world that he was a different kind of conqueror. He was not just a warrior, but a man of honor and piety. The fall of Jerusalem was a major turning point, but it was not the end of the Crusader States. Some castles, like the great Croix des Chevaliers, and a few coastal cities, most notably Tyre, still held out. The city of Tyre, under the brilliant and tenacious defense of Conrad of Montferrat, resisted Saladin's siege and became the new bastion of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The Crusader kingdom was now a kingdom in name only, a coastal strip of land with a handful of remaining strongholds. The news of the fall of Jerusalem, just like the news of the fall of Edessa, sent shockwaves through Europe. The Pope, Urban III, is said to have died of a heart attack upon hearing the news. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately issued a new call for a crusade, the Third Crusade, to reclaim the Holy City. This time, the call to arms was answered by the three most powerful monarchs in Europe: Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip Augustus, the King of France, and Richard the Lionheart, the King of England. The stage was now set for the greatest, most legendary of the Crusades, a crusade that would be marked by immense personalities, brutal battles, and political intrigue. The fall of Jerusalem was not the end of the Crusader story. It was merely the beginning of the next, epic chapter. The news of Jerusalem's fall ignited a fire in Europe, a passion for vengeance and reclamation. This time, the call to arms was answered not just by lords, but by the most powerful rulers of the day, a veritable dream team of medieval monarchs. There was Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, a wise and experienced ruler who at nearly 70 years old was still a formidable military leader. There was Philip II of France, known as Philip Augustus, a cunning and politically astute king who saw the crusade as an opportunity to expand his own power and prestige. And finally, there was Richard I of England, later known as Richard the Lionheart, a man of immense personal charisma and a brilliant, though often reckless, military mind. The Third Crusade was a clash of titans, and the world watched to see what would happen when these three men, with their massive armies, descended on the Holy Land. Frederick Barbarossa was the first to march. His army, a vast force of German knights and soldiers, took the land route through Anatolia, just as the armies of the First and Second Crusades had done. His journey was a repeat of the worst parts of those earlier crusades, a grueling march plagued by difficult terrain, disease, and the constant harassment of the Seljuk Turks. But Frederick, a man of incredible determination, pushed his army forward. They were on the verge of reaching the Holy Land when, in a tragic and bizarre accident, Frederick drowned while crossing the Salif River in what is now Turkey. His death was a devastating blow to the crusade. His army, demoralized and leaderless, largely disintegrated, with only a small remnant continuing onto the Holy Land. This was a massive loss of manpower and a sign of the ill fortune that seemed to plague the Crusades. With Frederick's death, the leadership of the crusade fell to the two remaining kings, Richard and Philip. But these two men were more rivals than allies. They had a history of conflict, and their personal animosity was a constant source of tension. Philip Augustus, a cautious and calculating man, was not a huge fan of Richard's impetuous and flamboyant style. Their journey to the Holy Land was not an easy one. They had to take the long sea route, and they bickered constantly over strategy, supplies, and everything in between. They finally arrived in the Holy Land and joined the siege of Acre, a city that the Crusaders had been trying to retake for nearly 2 years. The siege of Acre was a long, brutal, and bloody affair. It was a test of endurance for both sides, a grinding war of attrition. Saladin, who had a large army nearby, was constantly harassing the Crusaders, and the Crusaders, in turn, were trying to break into the city and fight off Saladin's relief efforts. The arrival of Richard the Lionheart changed the entire dynamic of the siege. He was a man who lived up to his nickname, a whirlwind of energy and courage. He was a master of siege warfare, and he brought with him powerful new siege engines and a relentless determination. His arrival revitalized the Crusader army, and under his command, the siege of Acre finally came to an end. The city surrendered in July 1191, a major victory for the Crusaders and a huge psychological blow to Saladin. The fall of Acre was a testament to the fact that when united under strong leadership, the Crusaders could be a formidable force. The victory, however, was not without its problems. The Crusaders, now with a major foothold in the Holy Land, were still plagued by internal conflicts. Philip Augustus, who had always been more interested in his own kingdom than in the Holy Land, decided that his mission was complete. Citing ill health, he returned to France, leaving Richard to lead the crusade alone. This was a betrayal that Richard would never forget. It also left him with the immense challenge of retaking Jerusalem with a reduced army and with a rival king back home who was now free to plot against his lands in France. With Philip gone, Richard was now the undisputed leader of the crusade. He had his eyes on Jerusalem, but he was a realist. He knew that taking Jerusalem would be a difficult task, but holding it would be impossible. He also knew that his time in the Holy Land was limited. He had to make a decision, a direct, possibly suicidal march on Jerusalem, or a more cautious campaign to secure the coastline and weaken Saladin. The choice he made would define his legacy and the future of the Crusader States. With Acre captured and Philip of France gone, the leadership of the Third Crusade fell entirely to Richard the Lionheart. He was a man with a singular focus, and his singular focus was winning. He began by solidifying the Crusader presence along the coast, a strategic move that was far more practical than a direct headlong assault on Jerusalem. He knew that to have any hope of taking and holding the Holy City, he needed to control the supply lines that came from the sea. His first step was to march down the coast toward Jaffa, a key port city. The march was not an easy one. Saladin's army was constantly harassing the Crusaders, a relentless campaign of skirmishes and ambushes. Richard, however, proved to be a masterful commander, a man who could think on his feet and adapt to the fluid nature of desert warfare. He organized his army into a tight, disciplined column, with the infantry on the outside, protecting the knights from the constant rain of arrows. This was a classic medieval military tactic that worked, but it was also a testament to Richard's ability to impose discipline on his often unruly troops. The two armies finally met in a decisive engagement at the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191. Saladin, believing he had the Crusaders on the run, launched a full-scale attack. Richard, however, held his men in check, refusing to give in to the temptation of a premature charge. He waited patiently until the moment was right, until Saladin's forces were close enough and vulnerable enough. When he finally gave the order to charge, the result was devastating. The Crusaders, led by the Knights Hospitaller and Richard himself, crashed into the Muslim lines with a fury that was breathtaking. The battle was a resounding victory for the Crusaders. It was not a total annihilation of Saladin's army, but it was a crucial psychological victory. It showed that the Franks could still defeat Saladin on a battlefield, a fact that had been in serious doubt since the disaster at Hattin. After Arsuf, Richard continued his march to Jaffa, and the city was soon taken. The Crusaders now controlled a significant portion of the coastline, from Acre in the north to Jaffa in the south. Richard had achieved a great deal, but he knew that his ultimate goal, Jerusalem, was still a long way off. He launched 2 separate marches on the Holy City, one in 1191 and another in 1192. Both times, he got within sight of the city's walls, but both times, he made the difficult but pragmatic decision to turn back. He knew that even if he could take the city, his army was not strong enough to hold it against a renewed attack from Saladin. He was a military genius, but he was also a realist. He understood that a symbolic victory was not worth a strategic disaster. The Third Crusade, then, ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, 2 of the greatest figures of the age, signed a truce in September 1192. The truce was a compromise. The Crusaders would keep control of the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, and Christian pilgrims would be allowed free access to the holy sites in Jerusalem. It was a deal that was not entirely satisfactory to either side, but it was a deal that was necessary. Richard was tired of fighting and had pressing issues back home, and Saladin was exhausted from years of campaigning. The Third Crusade was a failure in its primary goal of retaking Jerusalem, but it was also a partial success. It had restored a Crusader kingdom, even if it was a much smaller, weaker version of its former self. This new kingdom, with its capital at Acre, was a testament to Richard's military genius and his pragmatic leadership, but it was also a sign of the new reality in the Holy Land. The Crusaders were no longer conquerors, they were survivors. They had a small foothold, but their power was a shadow of what it once was. The great age of conquest was over. The Third Crusade also had a fascinating aftermath. Richard, on his way back to England, was shipwrecked and captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, a man he had deeply offended during the siege of Acre. He was then sold to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI and was held for a massive ransom. This was a political drama worthy of a modern movie, a perfect example of how the personal rivalries of medieval kings could have a massive impact on the course of history. After the Third Crusade and Richard the Lionheart's departure, the Crusader states were left in a peculiar and precarious position. The new Crusader kingdom was a small, thin strip of land along the coast, with its capital in the fortified city of Acre. It was a kingdom in name, but in reality, it was a shadow of its former self, a collection of a few key cities and castles surrounded by a unified and powerful Muslim empire. The Crusader presence was now a coastal one, dependent entirely on the sea for supplies, reinforcements, and survival. The loss of Jerusalem, the very heart and soul of their original mission, was a constant source of shame and a driving force for all future military and political decisions. The new capital, Acre, became a melting pot of cultures. It was a bustling port city, a major hub of trade where merchants from all over Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Muslim world came to do business. The city was a microcosm of the entire Crusader experiment, a place where different religions and nationalities coexisted, often uneasily. The city was divided into different quarters, with separate areas for the Venetians, Genoese, and Pisans, the great maritime republics of Italy, who had provided the crucial naval support for the Crusades. These Italian merchants were a powerful force in the city, and their rivalries were a constant source of friction. They would often go to war with each other in the streets of Acre, a sort of medieval gang war that was both absurd and very, very dangerous. But the most significant source of conflict was the internal struggles between the Crusader nobles and the military orders. The noble houses, like the Abelins, were often more interested in their own feudal power and the acquisition of more land. They were the old guard, the families who had been there for generations and had grown to be more Eastern than Western. They had a nuanced understanding of the local political landscape and were often in favor of a more pragmatic and diplomatic approach with their Muslim neighbors. They understood that the Crusader states could not survive by force alone. The military orders, on the other hand, were a different beast entirely. They were the professional soldiers of the kingdom, a well-armed and disciplined force that was fiercely loyal to the Pope, not to the King of Jerusalem. They saw their mission as a perpetual holy war against the infidel. They were often at odds with the local nobles, whom they saw as weak and corrupted by the comforts of the East. The Templars, in particular, with their immense wealth and power, were a kingdom within a kingdom, a powerful entity that often ignored the authority of the king. This constant infighting was a major source of weakness. It was a political game of thrones that left the Crusader states vulnerable to a new and even more aggressive external threat. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a kingdom in name, but it was a fragmented and weak collection of territories. The political power was not centralized in the hands of the king. It was distributed among the powerful noble houses and the military orders. This was a feudal system on steroids, a mess of overlapping jurisdictions and competing loyalties. The king was often just a figurehead, a puppet in the hands of the more powerful players. The lack of a strong, unified leadership was a major problem. This period after the Third Crusade was a time of relative calm, a period of truce and diplomacy with the Muslim world. But it was also a period of internal decay, a time when the Crusader states were being eaten away from within by their own squabbles. The Crusaders had learned to live with their neighbors, but they had not learned to live with each other. They were survivors in a hostile land, but their constant infighting was a ticking time bomb. The next wave of Crusaders, the so-called later Crusades, would be an even more confusing and disorganized affair, a series of military campaigns that would have little to do with the original goal of recapturing the Holy Land. The Crusader states, now the Kingdom of Acre, were an organism in decline, a patient with a chronic and ultimately fatal illness. They had survived, but their survival was precarious, and the sands of time were slowly running out. The internal struggles and constant infighting that plagued the Crusader states were about to be overshadowed by an external event of monumental and, frankly, ridiculous proportions. While the remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were bickering over who would rule, a new crusade was being organized in Europe, the Fourth Crusade. But this one would have little to do with the Holy Land. It was a crusade that went completely off the rails, a comedy of errors with tragic consequences. The crusade was initially conceived by Pope Innocent III, a man who believed in the power of the papacy and was determined to lead a successful crusade. He called on the knights of Europe to take up the cross and head to the Holy Land to finish what Richard the Lionheart had started. The Crusaders, mostly French knights and nobles, gathered in Venice. The plan was to hire a massive Venetian fleet to transport them to Egypt, which was seen as the heart of Muslim power in the region. But there was a problem, a classic medieval problem. The Crusaders didn't have enough money to pay the Venetians for their services. The Venetians, led by their shrewd and nearly blind doge, Enrico Dandolo, were not about to let a business opportunity slip by. They offered a deal. They would transport the Crusaders for free, but in return, the Crusaders would help them capture the city of Zara, a rebellious Christian city on the coast of what is now Croatia. This was a moral and political nightmare. Attacking a Christian city was strictly forbidden by the Pope, and many of the Crusaders were horrified, but they were in a bind. They had no money, and they were at the mercy of the Venetians. So, with a great deal of hesitation and against the Pope's wishes, they agreed. The Crusaders, who had set out to fight for the Holy Land, were now fighting for the economic interests of Venice. The city of Zara was captured, sacked, and the Pope, as one might expect, was furious. He excommunicated the entire crusade, but the story gets even more bizarre. While the Crusaders were in Zara, a young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos arrived and offered them an even more tempting and even more ethically dubious deal. He promised to pay them a massive sum of money, provide them with supplies, and even help them with their crusade if they would help him reclaim his throne in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Crusaders, now excommunicated and in desperate need of funds, agreed. They were no longer a religious army. They were a mercenary force for hire. They sailed to Constantinople, a city of immense wealth and power that had been the bastion of Eastern Christianity for centuries. The Crusaders were astonished by the size and splendor of the city. The Byzantines, for their part, were horrified by the sight of a massive Western army on their doorstep. The Crusaders laid siege to the city, and after a short but brutal fight, they managed to put their prince Alexios on the throne. But Alexios could not pay them what he had promised, and the city's populace, furious at their new ruler and the presence of the Western army, rebelled. What happened next was a tragedy of epic proportions. The Crusaders, feeling betrayed and angry, decided to take matters into their own hands. They sacked the city of Constantinople in 1204, a brutal and bloody affair that was far worse than the sack of Jerusalem. They looted the city, burned down its libraries, and desecrated its churches. They murdered and raped with a savagery that shocked the world. The Fourth Crusade which had started with a high-minded goal, had devolved into a self-interested and destructive mess. It was an embarrassment to the entire concept of crusading, and it did immense, long-lasting damage to the relationship between the Latin West and the Greek East. The sack of Constantinople was a major blow to the Byzantine Empire, which was a long-term strategic ally of the Crusader States. It left the Byzantine Empire a shadow of its former self and created a new enemy for the Crusaders on their eastern flank. It also provided no tangible benefit to the Crusader states in the Holy Land. In a moment of gentle sarcasm, one might say that the Fourth Crusade was a perfect example of a road trip that ended up in a completely different country and not in a good way. The Crusaders, with no money, no army, and a legacy of infighting, were still on their own. The Fourth Crusade had been an utter failure, a crusade that had not only failed to help the Latin East, but had actively harmed it by weakening its main ally, the Byzantine Empire. The Crusader states, now reduced to a coastal strip with its capital in Acre, were still a tiny Latin island in a vast Muslim sea. But the Muslim world was not a monolith. The death of Saladin in 1193 had once again fragmented the Ayyubid Empire he had so painstakingly built. His sons and brothers, known as the Ayyubid succession states, began fighting each other for control, a classic case of family squabbles that worked to the Crusaders' advantage. It was this disunity that allowed the Crusader states to survive. For the next few decades, the Crusader states lived in a state of relative calm, a period of truce and diplomacy that was a welcome relief after the constant warfare of the previous century. The Crusaders, now with a better understanding of the local political landscape, learned to exploit the rivalries between the Ayyubid princes. They would often sign treaties with one Ayyubid ruler against another, a pragmatic approach that prioritized survival over religious purity. It was a time of political intrigue, of shifting alliances and broken promises, a game of chess played with kingdoms. This period of quiet was interrupted by a new kind of crusader, not a unified army from Europe, but a series of small, uncoordinated campaigns. There was the Fifth Crusade, a disastrous affair that tried to capture Egypt, but failed miserably. It was a perfect example of what happened when a crusade was led by a man with no military experience, a papal legate named Pelagius, who had the political skills of a wet paper bag. Then came a new figure who would have a profound, if bizarre, impact on the history of the Crusader states, Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick II was a man unlike any other. He was a product of the Sicilian court, a place where Norman, Byzantine, Arab, and Jewish cultures had mingled for centuries. He spoke multiple languages, including Arabic, and he had a deep fascination with the Islamic worlds. He was a brilliant intellectual, a patron of the arts and sciences, but he was also a ruthless and Machiavellian ruler who was more interested in expanding his own power than in fighting for the Holy Land. The Pope, a man who saw Frederick as a threat to his own power, demanded that he go on a crusade. Frederick, a man who was not easily told what to do, delayed for years, and the Pope, in a fit of pique, excommunicated him. But Frederick, now excommunicated, finally decided to go on his crusade in 1228. This was a crusade that was completely unorthodox. He did not come with a massive army, nor did he come with a great deal of piety. He came with a handful of troops and a great deal of political cunning. He was a king with no divine favor, a crusader with no religious blessing. This was the most ridiculous crusade of all, a crusade led by a man who was, in the eyes of the church, a heretic. He did not march to war. He sailed to the Holy Land and began a long, patient negotiation with the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil. Al-Kamil, a man who was more interested in his own political rivalries than in fighting a war with the Franks, was surprisingly open to a deal. The two men, a Christian emperor and a Muslim sultan, found that they had a great deal in common. They had a shared interest in intellectual pursuits, and they had a mutual respect for each other's cultures. They spent months negotiating, and the result was a diplomatic masterpiece. In 1229, Frederick and Al-Kamil signed a treaty. The treaty was a political bombshell. It gave the Crusaders control of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and a strip of land connecting them to the coast. In return, Frederick promised to help Al-Kamil against his rivals. It was a remarkable achievement, a victory won without a single drop of blood. It was a testament to the power of diplomacy and a clear sign that the old ways of crusading were dead. But it was also a deeply controversial one. The Pope was furious that a man he had excommunicated had just won back the Holy City, and many of the more zealous crusaders were enraged that Jerusalem had been won by negotiation and not by blood. Frederick II's crusade was a success, but it was a Pyrrhic one. He had won back the Holy City, but he had done so in a way that had alienated him from his own people and had made him a figure of controversy in the West. He was a crusader who had won Jerusalem, but he had done so by becoming a friend of a Muslim ruler, and that was a bridge too far for many. Frederick II's diplomatic victory in 1229 was a moment of fleeting peace for the Crusader states. Jerusalem was back in Christian hands, but it was a city without defenses, a symbolic prize with no strategic value. The political situation in the Holy Land was as complex as ever, with the Crusaders and the Ayyubid succession states constantly shifting alliances. But a new power was about to emerge, a power that would not be interested in diplomacy or negotiation. This new power was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks were not a dynasty in the traditional sense. They were a military caste of slave soldiers, mostly of Turkic and Circassian descent, who had been bought and trained to be elite warriors. They were fierce, disciplined, and loyal to a fault. They had been the backbone of the Ayyubid army for decades, but in 1250 they staged a coup, seizing power from the last of the Ayyubid sultans and establishing their own dynasty. Their leaders were hardened military men who had little time for the niceties of courtly life or the complexities of diplomacy. Their sole focus was on military conquest and the preservation of their own power. The rise of the Mamluks was a major turning point for the Crusader states. They were a new kind of enemy, a military machine that was focused on one thing: driving the Franks out of the Holy Land once and for all. Their leaders, men like Baibars, were not just ambitious, they were ruthless and brilliant military commanders who were determined to succeed where all others had failed. Baibars, in particular, was a figure of immense talent and cruelty. He had been a Mamluk commander who had helped defeat the Crusaders at the Battle of La Forby in 1244, and had been a key player in the coup that put the Mamluks in power. He was a man who understood that the Crusader states were weak, divided, and ripe for the picking. The first major blow came in 1244. A large mercenary force of Khwarezmian Turks, a nomadic people who had been displaced by the Mongol invasions, entered the Holy Land and, with the encouragement of the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, marched on Jerusalem. The city, which was now undefended, fell quickly. The Khwarezmians massacred the Christian population and desecrated the holy sites. It was a brutal and shocking event, and it effectively ended the period of peaceful coexistence that Frederick II had engineered. The Latin Christian population was never again to have control over Jerusalem. In response, the Crusaders and their Muslim allies formed an alliance and met the Khwarezmians and the Egyptian army at the Battle of La Forby. It was a total disaster for the Crusader forces. They were completely annihilated, a defeat that was even more devastating than Hattin. This battle, while not as famous as Hattin, was a major turning point. It had a profound psychological impact on the Crusader states and permanently altered the balance of power in the region. The Crusader states had lost their last large field army, and they would never be able to field a force of that size again. They were now completely at the mercy of the Mamluks. The Mamluks, under the leadership of Baibars, launched a relentless campaign of conquest. They began by systematically dismantling the Crusader castles, the very symbols of their power and permanence. One by one, the great fortresses, like the formidable Crac des Chevaliers, fell to Baibars' siege engines. They were not just taking the castles, they were destroying them brick by brick, so that they could never again be used to project Frankish power. Baibars was a methodical and patient commander, and he knew that the key to defeating the Crusaders was not just in winning battles, but in destroying their infrastructure. The Crusader states were now in a state of terminal decline. They were a patient on life support, and the Mamluks were slowly and methodically pulling the plug. The internal squabbles between the military orders and the noble houses were worse than ever, and there was a general sense of panic and despair. The Crusader states were now a footnote in history, a fading memory of a great dream that had turned into a long, slow nightmare. The final act was about to begin, and it would not be a glorious finale, but a quiet and humiliating end. The Crusader presence was now a shadow of its former self, a few scattered cities and castles waiting for the inevitable to come. The era of the Crusader states was nearing its quiet, unceremonious conclusion. The Mamluk Sultan Baibars was a force of nature, a brilliant and ruthless commander who had no time for the old, fragmented way of doing things. He was not interested in temporary truces or diplomatic posturing. He was interested in conquest. He began a systematic campaign to dismantle the Crusader states, one city and one castle at a time. The Crusaders, plagued by internal infighting and a dwindling supply of manpower from Europe, were completely unprepared for this new level of aggression. They were a house divided, and Baibars was a wrecking ball. The first major target was the Principality of Antioch. Antioch, a city with a history that stretched back to the First Crusade, had been a crucial northern bulwark for the Crusader States. It was a wealthy and powerful principality, but its prince, Bohemond of was more interested in fighting with his Armenian and Byzantine neighbors than in uniting with the rest of the Crusader states. Baibars, seeing an opportunity, laid siege to the city in 1268. The siege was brutal and short. The city's defenses, while still formidable, were no match for the Mamluks' powerful siege engines and the relentless determination of their leader. The city fell in a matter of days. The sack of Antioch was a horrifying event. Baibars' army, after breaching the walls, went on a rampage. They slaughtered the city's inhabitants, looting and burning everything in their path. The city's ancient churches and libraries were desecrated, and its art and treasures were either stolen or destroyed. The Principality of Antioch, which had been in existence for over 160 years, was now a smoking ruin. The loss of Antioch was a devastating blow to the Crusader states. It was not just the loss of a city, it was the loss of a major Crusader state, a symbol of their permanence and power in the East. It showed the Crusaders and the rest of the world that the Mamluks were not just a new dynasty. They were a force to be reckoned with, a power that had no intention of letting the Crusader presence in the Holy Land continue. The Crusader states were now in a state of terminal decline. The fall of Antioch was a sign of the quiet, inexorable end that was coming. They were now reduced to a few scattered cities and castles along the coast, a handful of dots on a map surrounded by a powerful and unified enemy. The Crusaders' only hope was a miracle, a new crusade from Europe, but the Crusaders in the West were preoccupied with their own political squabbles and had little interest in the fate of the Latin East. But as the Crusader states were facing their end, a new and even more terrifying force appeared on the eastern horizon, the Mongols. The Mongols, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, had, in a few short years, built the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Their armies, led by fearsome generals, were sweeping across the Middle East, destroying cities and kingdoms in their path. Their approach was a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. The Crusaders and the Muslims, who had been fighting each other for centuries, were now faced with a common enemy, a foe that was more powerful and more ruthless than anything they had ever seen. The Mongols, led by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, captured and sacked Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, in 1258, a monumental event that sent shockwaves throughout the Muslim world. The Abbasid Caliph was executed, and the city was completely destroyed. The Mongol army then moved west, marching on Syria and threatening Egypt. For the Crusaders, the Mongols were a strange and confusing new ally. They were a pagan people, a non-Christian force, but they were also the enemies of the Mamluks. They saw an opportunity to form an alliance with the Mongols against their Muslim rivals. Some of the Crusader lords, like Bohemond of Antioch, did just that. He even became a vassal of the Mongol Empire, a move that was deeply unpopular with the Pope and many of the other Crusader lords. The Mongols, however, were not a reliable ally. Their vast empire was not a unified force, and they were often plagued by internal conflicts and a general lack of interest in the affairs of the Near East. In 1260, the Mongols suffered a major defeat at the hands of the Mamluks at the Battle of Ain Jalut. It was a historic victory, the first time the Mongols had ever been decisively defeated in a field battle. This victory cemented the Mamluks as the new dominant power in the region and shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. For the Crusaders, it was a moment of bitter disappointment. Their potential new ally was gone, and their most formidable enemy was now stronger than ever. The Mongol defeat at Ain Jalut was a disaster for the Crusader states. Their only hope of a powerful ally against the Mamluks was now gone, and their most formidable enemy, the Mamluk Sultanate, was now stronger than ever. The Mamluk leader Baibars, having defeated both the Crusaders and the Mongols, was now a legend in the Muslim world, and he used his new status to launch a relentless and systematic campaign to finish what he had started. His strategy was simple: dismantle the Crusader presence, one city and one castle at a time, destroying them so thoroughly that they could never again be used to project power. The Crusader states were now a patient with a chronic and ultimately fatal illness. The loss of Antioch in 1268 was a devastating blow, but it was just the beginning. Baibars then turned his attention to the great Crusader fortresses, the very symbols of their power and permanence. These castles, which had once been thought to be impregnable, were no match for the Mamluks' powerful siege engines and their massive army. One by one, they fell. The great Crac des Chevaliers, a massive hospitaller fortress that had been a bastion of Crusader power for centuries, finally fell to Baibars' siege in 1271. It was a long and difficult siege, but the Mamluks eventually prevailed. The fall of Crac was a psychological blow of immense proportions. It showed that even the most formidable of the Crusader castles could not withstand the might of the Mamluks. Baibars was not just interested in taking the castles, he was interested in destroying them. He systematically dismantled them, brick by brick, so that they could never again be used against him. He was not a conqueror in the old style, a man who would take a castle and then move on. He was a destroyer, a man who understood that to defeat a culture, you had to first destroy its symbols of power. He was a force of pure, unadulterated will, and he would not stop until the last Frankish presence was gone from the Holy Land. The Crusader states, now a few scattered cities along the coast, were in a state of terminal decline. The internal infighting between the military orders and the noble houses was worse than ever. The Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar, once united in their purpose, were now bitter rivals, often fighting each other in the streets of Acre. The Venetians and the Genoese, the great maritime republics who had been the economic backbone of the Crusader states, were also at each other's throats, engaging in a series of destructive street wars. The Crusader states were a house of cards, and their foundations were being eaten away from within. The Western powers, who had once sent massive armies to the Holy Land, were now preoccupied with their own political squabbles. There were a few small, half-hearted crusades, but they were more about political posturing than about genuine support for the Crusader states. King Louis IX of France, a deeply pious man, launched a crusade to Egypt in 1248, but it was a total disaster. He was defeated and captured, and he had to be ransomed for a massive sum of money. It was a humiliating defeat that showed that the old crusading spirit was gone. The Crusader states were a patient on life support, and the Mamluks were slowly and methodically pulling the plug. The death of Baybars in 1277 did not change anything. His successors were just as determined to drive the Franks out of the Holy Land. The Mamluk Sultan Kalawun was an equally ruthless and brilliant commander, and he continued Baybars' systematic campaign of conquest. His eyes were on the last of the Crusader strongholds, and he was determined to take them all. The era of the Crusader states was nearing its quiet, unceremonious conclusion. The Crusaders were a footnote in history, a fading memory of a great dream that had turned into a long, slow nightmare. They were now just a few scattered cities and castles waiting for the inevitable to come. The era of the Crusader states was nearing its quiet, unceremonious conclusion. The fall of Tripoli in 1289 was a clear sign that the end was near. The Crusader states, now reduced to the single city of Acre and a few surrounding towns, were a patient on its deathbed. The Mamluk Sultan Kalawun, a brilliant and methodical commander, had his eyes on the last Crusader stronghold. But in a strange twist of fate, he died shortly after the siege of Tripoli. His son and successor, Al-Ashraf Khalil, was an even more aggressive and determined ruler. He was a man who was obsessed with completing his father's work and driving the Franks out of the Holy Land once and for all. He was a man of his word, and he was ready to deliver the final blow. The Crusader states were not entirely without hope. There had been a new crusade called in Europe, but it was a pathetic affair. A small and disorganized force of knights and pilgrims who arrived in Acre with little in the way of supplies or a clear plan. They were more interested in brawling with the locals than in fighting the Mamluks, and their arrival only made the situation worse. The Crusaders, in a moment of utter desperation, had also turned to their old, unreliable allies, the Mongols. The Mongols, who were still at war with the Mamluks, were more than willing to accept an alliance, but their help was always a temporary and unreliable reprieve. The Mongols were a nomadic people, a force that was more interested in raiding and pillaging than in holding territory, and their aid was a false hope in a sea of despair. The Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, was not a patient man. He had a clear goal, the complete destruction of the Crusader presence. He began his campaign by launching a massive and unprecedented siege of Acre in 1291. The Mamluk army was a terrifying sight. It was a massive force of over 100,000 men, with a fleet of hundreds of ships and an arsenal of powerful new siege engines. The siege was a total and complete effort, a testament to the Mamluks' determination to end the Crusader states once and for all. Acre was a city with a long and storied history, but it was now a city under a death sentence. Its defenses, while still formidable, were no match for the Mamluks' overwhelming force. The city was a chaotic and desperate place. The internal squabbles between the military orders and the noble houses were worse than ever. The Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar, once united in their purpose, were now bitter rivals, often fighting each other in the streets of Acre. The Venetians and the Genoese, the great maritime republics, were also at each other's throats, engaging in a series of destructive street wars. The Crusader states were a house of cards, and their foundations were being eaten away from within. The siege of Acre was a slow, methodical, and utterly brutal affair. The Mamluk army, with its powerful siege engines, pounded the walls day and night. The Crusaders, led by the master of the Knights Templar, Guillaume de Beaujeu, fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Mamluks, in a testament to their patience and their determination, did not rush the city. They waited for the right moment, for a weak point in the walls, and then they struck. The final assault was a ferocious and bloody affair. The Mamluks, after breaching the walls, poured into the city, and the fighting was fierce. The Crusaders, knowing that their fate was sealed, fought with a desperate bravery, but it was not enough. On May 18th, 1291, the city of Acre finally fell. The Mamluks, in their fury, went on a rampage. They slaughtered the city's inhabitants, looting and burning everything in their path. The great libraries, the magnificent churches, and the bustling markets were all burned. The city was left a smoking ruin, a grim monument to the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The fall of Acre was a major turning point in history. It was the end of the Crusader States, the end of a long and bloody chapter in the history of the Mediterranean world. The fall of Acre was a major turning point, but it was not the end of the story. A few small coastal cities and castles like Tyre and Sidon still held out, but they were now completely isolated, and their defenses were no match for the Mamluk army. They were abandoned shortly after the fall of Acre, and the last of the Crusaders left the Holy Land. The Crusader presence was now a fading memory, a story of a great dream that had turned into a long, slow nightmare. The era of the Crusader States was over, and the Latin presence in the Holy Land was gone forever. The fall of Acre in 1291 was not just the end of a city, it was the symbolic end of the Crusader States. But the story was not quite over. A few small, isolated strongholds remained, and the Crusaders who had escaped the massacre in Acre found refuge in them. The last remnants of the Latin presence in the Holy Land were the coastal cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut. But these cities, now completely cut off from the sea and from any hope of reinforcement, were in a hopeless position. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, a man obsessed with completing his father's work, did not rest. He launched a new campaign, a swift and brutal campaign to finish what he had started. The remaining Crusader garrisons, knowing that resistance was futile, abandoned their posts. The city of Tyre was the first to fall. Its inhabitants, a mix of Latin and local Christians, had fled in terror to Cyprus. The Mamluk army, upon arriving at the city gates, found it completely empty. They entered and razed the city to the ground, leaving nothing but a smoking ruin. The same fate befell Sidon and Beirut. The Crusaders, in a final act of desperation, fled to the island of Cyprus, a nearby island that had been in Crusader hands since the time of Richard the Lionheart. It was here, in a foreign land, that the last remnants of the Crusader states lived out their final days. The Crusader states were gone, and the Latin presence in the Holy Land was over. But the idea of crusading was not. The fall of Acre had a profound psychological impact on Europe. It was seen as a humiliation, a sign of divine disfavor, and a challenge to the power and prestige of the papacy. There were new calls for a crusade, but they were now more about political posturing and less about a genuine desire to retake the Holy Land. There were a few small disorganized crusades in the next century, but they were more about trying to recapture the glory of the past than about a serious attempt to reverse the course of history. The Crusader states had a profound and lasting legacy. They had been a strange and unique social experiment, a blending of European and Eastern cultures that had a profound impact on both. They had brought with them new forms of military technology, like the great stone castles, which were a marvel of medieval engineering. These castles, which were built to withstand a siege, were not just defensive strongholds. They were also symbols of the Crusader presence, a clear sign that they were here to stay. The Crusader states had also had a profound impact on the Muslim world. The Crusaders had been an external threat, but they had also been a force that had brought a new level of unity to the Muslim world. The constant struggle against the Crusaders had created a sense of shared identity and a common purpose, a feeling that had been lost after the fall of the great Arab empires. The Crusaders were a constant source of friction, but they were also a force that had helped to create a new, more powerful, and more unified Muslim world. The Crusaders also brought back to Europe a great deal of new knowledge. They brought back with them new spices, silks, and other goods from the East, which helped to fuel a new age of commerce and exploration. They also brought back with them new forms of architecture, art, and literature. The Crusader states were a cultural crossroads, a place where different cultures had met and mingled, and the legacy of that cultural exchange can still be seen in the art and architecture of Europe today. The Crusader states were a fascinating and complex chapter in the history of the Mediterranean world. They had been a great dream that had turned into a long, slow nightmare, a story of a great ambition that had been swallowed by the sands of time. But their legacy was not a story of a failure. It was a story of a great ambition that had a profound and lasting impact on both the East and the West. The Crusader states were gone, but their legacy was not. It was a legacy that would live on in the memories of both Christians and Muslims, a story that would be told and retold for centuries to come. The fall of the Crusader states in the Holy Land was not the end of the crusading idea. Far from it. The idea of crusading had now been transplanted to other parts of the world. In Spain, the long struggle against the Moors, known as the Reconquista, was now seen as a crusade. The Iberian Peninsula was a new front in the struggle between Christendom and Islam, and the knights and soldiers who fought there saw themselves as crusaders. They were fighting for their own lands, but they were also fighting for a larger cause, a holy war that had been sanctioned by the Pope. The Reconquista was a slower, more methodical, and ultimately more successful crusade than the ones in the Holy Land. It was a centuries-long struggle that ended with the final expulsion of the Moors from Spain in 1492. In the Baltic region, a new and different kind of crusade was being fought. The Teutonic Knights, a German military order that had been founded in the Holy Land, had moved their operations to the Baltic. They were invited by the Polish Duke Conrad of Masovia to help him fight the pagan Prussian tribes. The Teutonic Knights, a powerful and well-organized military order took up the task with a great deal of gusto. They began a long, brutal, and ultimately successful campaign to conquer and convert the pagan tribes of the Baltic. Their mission was not to retake a holy city, but to conquer a new territory and to spread the word of God with a sword if necessary. The Teutonic Knights built a vast militaristic state in the Baltic, a state that was run like a military dictatorship. It was a crusade that was more about land and power than it was about piety, a perfect example of how the idea of crusading had been corrupted and changed over time. The Crusades had also left a lasting legacy on the European psyche. The idea of the crusader, the brave and pious knight who fought for God, became a powerful and enduring myth. The image of the crusader was used to justify a wide range of military and political actions, from the wars against the Turks in Eastern Europe to the colonization of the Americas. The Crusades had also created a new kind of social and political institution, the military order. The Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar were the most famous of these orders, but there were many others. These orders were a hybrid of military and monastic life, a new kind of institution that had a profound impact on the military and political history of Europe. They were a powerful and well-organized force that was not loyal to any king or emperor, but only to the Pope. They were a force that was often a source of friction and a source of power, a testament to the strange and complex legacy of the Crusades. The Crusades also left a legacy of immense wealth and a new age of commerce. The Crusader States had been a major hub of trade, and the European merchants who had lived and worked there had brought back with them new spices, silks, and other goods from the East. This new commerce helped to fuel a new age of exploration and a new age of economic growth in Europe. The Crusades, which had started with a great deal of piety, had ended with a great deal of profit. They were a perfect example of how the religious fervor of the Middle Ages had been transformed by the economic and political realities of the world. The Crusader States were a fascinating and complex chapter in the history of the Mediterranean world. They had been a great dream that had turned into a long, slow nightmare, a story of a great ambition that had been swallowed by the sands of time. But their legacy was not a story of a failure. It was a story of a great ambition that had a profound and lasting impact on both the East and the West. The Crusader states were gone, but their legacy was not. It was a legacy that would live on in the memories of both Christians and Muslims, a story that would be told and retold for centuries to come. The fall of the Crusader states in the Holy Land was not just a military defeat. It was the end of a long, strange, and often brutal experiment. It marked a profound shift in the balance of power in the Mediterranean world. The Latin presence, which had been a constant source of friction and a major player in the region for over 2 centuries, was now gone. The Muslim world, which had been so fragmented for so long, was now unified under the powerful and militaristic Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks, having defeated both the Crusaders and the Mongols, were now the undisputed masters of the Near East. The Mamluks, however, did not have a monopoly on power. A new force was rising in Anatolia, a small Turkish emirate that would one day become a great empire. These were the Ottomans. They were a nomadic people, a group of Turkish tribes that had been pushed out of Central Asia by the Mongols and had settled in what is now modern-day Turkey. They were a military people, a people who were more interested in conquest than in commerce. They were a threat to the Byzantine Empire, and they were a threat to the rest of Europe. The fall of the Crusader States had not ended the struggle between East and West. It had merely shifted it to a new front. The Crusades had a lasting and profound impact on both the East and the West. For the East, the Crusades were a period of immense violence and destruction. They were a foreign invasion, a brutal and bloody conflict that had left a permanent scar on the historical memory of the region. The Crusades also had a profound impact on the political and cultural landscape of the East. The constant struggle against the Crusaders had created a sense of shared identity and a common purpose, a feeling that had been lost after the fall of the great Arab empires. The Crusaders were a constant source of friction, but they were also a force that had helped to create a new, more powerful, and more unified Muslim world. For the West, the Crusades were a period of great religious fervor, a time of immense military ambition, and a time of great cultural exchange. The Crusaders had brought back with them new spices, silks, and other goods from the East, which helped to fuel a new age of commerce and exploration. They also brought back with them new forms of architecture, art, and literature. The Crusader States were a cultural crossroads, a place where different cultures had met and mingled, and the legacy of that cultural exchange can still be seen in the art and architecture of Europe today. The Crusades also had a profound impact on the relationship between the Latin West and the Byzantine East. The Fourth Crusade, which had ended with the sack of Constantinople, was a major blow to the Byzantine Empire and a permanent source of animosity between the two halves of Christendom. The Crusaders, who had been a potential ally against the Turks, were now seen as a threat, a group of unruly and avaricious barbarians who were more interested in looting and conquest than in a holy war. This distrust and animosity would last for centuries and would have a profound impact on the political and military history of the Mediterranean world. The Crusader States were a fascinating and complex chapter in the history of the Mediterranean world. They had been a great dream that had turned into a long, slow nightmare, a story of a great ambition that had been swallowed by the sands of time. But their legacy was not a story of a failure. It was a story of a great ambition that had a profound and lasting impact on both the East and the West. The Crusader States were gone, but their legacy was not. It was a legacy that would live on in the memories of both Christians and Muslims, a story that would be told and retold for centuries to come. The era of the Crusader States was over, and a new era of global interaction, both peaceful and violent, had just begun. The end of the Crusader States in the Holy Land in 1291 was not the final word on the matter of crusading. The idea itself proved to be remarkably resilient, but it transformed into something quite different. Crusading became a concept that was no longer limited to the Holy Land. The Latin West had seen what could be done with a massive, coordinated military and religious effort, and they began to apply the same concept to other conflicts often with a much greater degree of success. The first of these, and the one with the most enduring legacy, was the Reconquistas in Spain. This was a centuries-long struggle by the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula to drive out the Muslim Moors. It was a holy war sanctioned by the Pope, and the knights and soldiers who fought there were considered crusaders. This long and grinding conflict, which was fought on a familiar landscape, was far more successful than the sporadic, ill-conceived crusades in the Holy Land. It ended with the final expulsion of the Moors from Spain in 1492, a victory that was celebrated throughout Christendom. The second transformation of the crusading idea was in the Baltic region, where a different kind of holy war was being fought. The Teutonic Knights, a German military order that had been founded in the Holy Land, moved their operations to the Baltic. They were invited by the Polish Duke Conrad of Masovia to help him fight the pagan Prussian tribes. The Teutonic Knights, a powerful and well-organized military order, took up the task with a great deal of gusto. They began a long, brutal, and ultimately successful campaign to conquer and convert the pagan tribes of the Baltic. Their mission was not to retake a holy city, but to conquer a new territory and to spread the word of God with a sword if necessary. The Teutonic Knights built a vast militaristic state in the Baltic, a state that was run like a military dictatorship. It was a crusade that was more about land and power than it was about piety, a perfect example of how the idea of crusading had been corrupted and changed over time. The Crusades had also left a lasting legacy on the European psyche. The idea of the Crusader, the brave and pious knight who fought for God, became a powerful and enduring myth. The image of the Crusader was used to justify a wide range of military and political actions, from the wars against the Turks in Eastern Europe to the colonizations of the Americas. The Crusades had also created a new kind of social and political institution, the military order. The Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar were the most famous of these orders, but there are many others. These orders were a hybrid of military and monastic life, a new kind of institution that had a profound impact on the military and political history of Europe. They were a powerful and well-organized force that was not loyal to any king or emperor, but only to the Pope. They were a force that was often a source of friction and a source of power, a testament to the strange and complex legacy of the Crusades. The Crusades also left a legacy of immense wealth and a new age of commerce. The Crusader states had been a major hub of trade, and the European merchants who had lived and worked there had brought back with them new spices, silks, and other goods from the East. This new commerce helped to fuel a new age of exploration and a new age of economic growth in Europe. The Crusades, which had started with a great deal of piety, had ended with a great deal of profit. They were a perfect example of how the religious fervor of the Middle Ages had been transformed by the economic and political realities of the world. The Crusades, in a way, had prepared the ground for the great age of exploration and colonization that was to come. The fall of the Crusader states in the Holy Land was a decisive moment in the history of the Mediterranean, but it was not the end of the story. The Muslim world, now unified under the Mamluk Sultanate, was a new and powerful force, and it would dominate the region for centuries. The Mamluks, having defeated both the Crusaders and the Mongols, were now the undisputed masters of the Near East. They were a military people, a people who had little interest in the subtleties of diplomacy or the intricacies of courtly life. Their sole focus was on military conquest and the preservation of their own power. They were a disciplined and ruthless military machine, and they would not tolerate any challenge to their authority. But as the Mamluks were consolidating their power, a new force was rising in Anatolia, a small Turkish emirate that would one day become a great empire. These were the Ottomans. They were a nomadic people, a group of Turkish tribes that had been pushed out of Central Asia by the Mongols and had settled in what is now modern-day Turkey. They were a military people, a people who were more interested in conquest than in commerce. They were a threat to the Byzantine Empire, and they were a threat to the rest of Europe. The fall of the Crusader States had not ended the struggle between East and West. It had merely shifted it to a new front. The Crusades had a lasting and profound impact on both the East and the West. For the East, the Crusades were a period of immense violence and destruction. They were a foreign invasion, a brutal and bloody conflict that had left a permanent scar on the historical memory of the region. The Crusades also had a profound impact on the political and cultural landscape of the East. The constant struggle against the Crusaders had created a sense of shared identity and a common purpose, a feeling that had been lost after the fall of the great Arab empires. The Crusaders were a constant source of friction, but they were also a force that had helped to create a new, more powerful, and more unified Muslim world. For the West, the Crusades were a period of great religious fervor, a time of immense military ambition, and a time of great cultural exchange. The Crusaders had brought back with them new spices, silks, and other goods from the East, which helped to fuel a new age of commerce and exploration. They also brought back with them new forms of architecture, art, and literature. The Crusader States were a cultural crossroads, a place where different cultures had met and mingled, and the legacy of that cultural exchange can still be seen in the art and architecture of Europe today. The Crusades also had a profound impact on the relationship between the Latin West and the Byzantine East. The Fourth Crusade, which had ended with the sack of Constantinople, was a major blow to the Byzantine Empire and a permanent source of animosity between the two halves of Christendom. The Crusaders, who had been a potential ally against the Turks, were now seen as a threat, a group of unruly and avaricious barbarians who were more interested in looting and conquest than in a holy war. This distrust and animosity would last for centuries and would have a profound impact on the political and military history of the Mediterranean world. The legacy of the Crusader States was a complex one, a story of a great ambition that had a profound and lasting impact on both the East and the West. The Crusader States were gone, but their legacy was not. It was a legacy that would live on in the memories of both Christians and Muslims, a story that would be told and retold for centuries to come. The era of the Crusader States was over, and a new era of global interaction, both peaceful and violent, had just begun. The end of the Crusader States in 1291 did not mean the end of the crusading ideal. The idea, now unmoored from the specific goal of reclaiming the Holy Land, transformed and spread to other parts of the world. In the Iberian Peninsula, the long-standing conflict against the Muslim Moors, the Reconquista, took on the full character of a crusade. It was a centuries-long holy war sanctioned by the Pope, and the knights and soldiers who fought there saw themselves as true crusaders. Unlike the scattered campaigns in the Levant, this conflict was fought on a familiar landscape, and it was ultimately successful. The Reconquista culminated in the final expulsion of the Moors from Spain in 1492, a victory that was celebrated throughout Christendom and marked the end of a long and defining era for Spain. Simultaneously, a new and different kind of holy war emerged in the Baltic region. The Teutonic Knights, a German military order, shifted their focus from the Holy Land to the north. They were invited by the Polish Duke Conrad of Masovia to help him fight the pagan Prussian tribes. The Teutonic Knights, a powerful and highly organized military force, took up the task with zeal. They began a long, brutal, and successful campaign to conquer and forcibly convert the pagan tribes of the Baltic. Their mission wasn't to recapture a sacred city, but to conquer new territory and spread Christianity by force if necessary. They built a vast militaristic state in the Baltic, run like a military dictatorship. This was a crusade more driven by land and power than by piety, illustrating how the crusading idea had been corrupted and changed over time. The legacy of the Crusades also profoundly affected the European psyche. The image of the Crusader, a brave and pious knight fighting for God, became a powerful and enduring myth. This ideal was used to justify a wide range of military and political actions, from wars against the Ottoman Turks in Eastern Europe to the colonization of the Americas. The Crusades also created a new type of social and political institution, the military order. The Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar were the most famous, but there were many others. These orders, a unique hybrid of military and monastic life, had a profound impact on the political and military history of Europe. They were powerful, well-organized forces, loyal only to the Pope, often acting as a state within a state. Economically, the Crusades opened a new age of commerce. The Crusader states had been major hubs of trade, and European merchants who lived and worked there brought back new spices, silks, and other goods from the East. This influx of new goods and ideas helped fuel the growth of a new merchant class and a new age of economic expansion in Europe. The Crusades, which began with religious fervor, ended up with significant economic and cultural consequences. They were a perfect example of how the religious enthusiasm of the Middle Ages was transformed by the economic and political realities of the world. In a way, the Crusades laid the groundwork for the great age of exploration and global trade that was to come. The Crusader states were a fascinating and complex chapter in the history of the Mediterranean world. They were a great dream that devolved into a long, slow nightmare. A story of ambition swallowed by the sands of time. However, their legacy was not one of simple failure. It was a legacy of a great ambition that had a profound and lasting impact on both the East and the West, shaping their interactions for centuries to come. The final act of the crusading saga, in a way, played out far from the Holy Land, in a long twilight struggle against a rising Eastern power that would eventually eclipse all others. The Mamluk Sultanate, having successfully expelled the Crusaders from the Levant, was the dominant force in the region, but its dominance was soon to be challenged by a new and formidable foe, the Ottomans. A small Turkish emirate in Anatolia, the Ottomans began a slow, methodical expansion that would eventually lead to the conquest of the Byzantine Empire and the formation of a vast, multi-ethnic empire that would last for centuries. The Crusades, in a strange twist of fate, had not ended the struggle between East and West. They had merely shifted it to a new front, and the battleground was now Eastern Europe and the Aegean Sea. The Crusades had a lasting and profound impact on both the East and the West. For the East, they were a period of immense violence and destruction, a foreign invasion that had left a permanent scar on the historical memory of the region. The Crusades also had a profound impact on the political and cultural landscape of the East. The constant struggle against the Crusaders had created a sense of shared identity and a common purpose, a feeling that had been lost after the fall of the great Arab empires. The Crusaders were a constant source of friction, but they were also a force that had helped to create a new, more powerful, and more unified Muslim world. For the West, the Crusades were a period of great religious fervor, a time of immense military ambition, and a time of great cultural exchange. The Crusaders had brought back with them new spices, silks, and other goods from the East, which helped to fuel a new age of commerce and exploration. They also brought back with them new forms of architecture, art, and literature. The Crusader States were a cultural crossroads, a place where different cultures had met and mingled, and the legacy of that cultural exchange can still be seen in the art and architecture of Europe today. The Crusades also had a profound impact on the relationship between the Latin West and the Byzantine East. The Fourth Crusade, which had ended with the sack of Constantinople, was a major blow to the Byzantine Empire and a permanent source of animosity between the two halves of Christendom. The Crusaders, who had been a potential ally against the Turks, were now seen as a threat, a group of unruly and avaricious barbarians who were more interested in looting and conquest than in a holy war. This distrust and animosity would last for centuries and would have a profound impact on the political and military history of the Mediterranean world. The legacy of the Crusader States was a complex one, a story of a great ambition that had a profound and lasting impact on both the East and the West. The Crusader States were gone, but their legacy was not. It was a legacy that would live on in the memories of both Christians and Muslims, a story that would be told and retold for centuries to come. The era of the Crusader States was over, and a new era of global interaction, both peaceful and violent, had just begun. The story of the Crusades is a story of a great ambition that turned into a long, slow nightmare, a story of a great dream that was swallowed by the sands of time. But it is also a story of a new age of exploration, a new age of commerce, and a new age of cultural exchange. It is a story that is still being written today, and a story that is still being told.